To be, to become, to begin, where the river leans to the sea. To learn, to let go, to love. The world turns endless, turning me.
Well, I think they're connected. Let's maybe start with money. I think that might be the easier one.
Okay.
So why are the systems change projects in general, but maybe specifically the Game B implementation projects, Proto Bs, etc., chronically underfunded? What's the problem of for them to attract funding?
Yes. And I would say there haven't been that many real Game B projects tried, maybe 7 or 8, something like that. But I know many, many, many other projects in different
Hmm.
adjacencies that have been tried. And I think that essentially all of them have failed for one of two reasons. One, and probably the majority, is insufficiently capitalized,
Hmm.
i.e., not enough money for what they're actually trying to do. And then the second is internal conflict, either the wrong set of people or the lack of governance modalities or both. But let's talk about the
Hmm.
money one first. Now, this is,
Hmm. Hmm.
I think it's highly analogous to doing a startup.
Hmm.
My startup days were back in the 80s and early 90s when it took a lot of money to do anything. You couldn't do shit for less than about $1 million, right? Now, of course, you can do a lot for a lot less than that. But at any given time, there's some amount of money you actually need to do to create something that has forward momentum in the marketplace. And
Hmm.
if you can't get that much money, then you shouldn't do it. This is one of my
Hmm.
great counsels to people. I think I've saved people a lot of heartache. They probably had to miss a few opportunities too, because there are occasionally people who luck out, but it's not the way to bet. And in fact, I have a presentation I do, haven't done it in years, but I used to do it, called From Idea to Exit, and laid out a whole bunch of steps. And one of the themes was, should you shoot the puppy, right? Should you
Hmm.
kill the project? And one of the key shoot the puppy steps was I basically metaphorically said a startup is like building a bridge across a river. Uh,
Hmm.
and you don't want to build a bridge halfway across a river. It's totally useless. And when I defined the bridge and the river, I said essentially the covenant entrepreneurs make with investors is they're going to take X amount of money. And when they're done with X amount of money, the business will clearly be worth more than it is today. Okay.
Hmm.
And of course, sometimes you're wrong and it takes more money, but at least you can see that that's what you're trying to do and you're making forward motion in good faith. And I've always been a believer in that way of thinking. And I recoil, and many, many, many people are in this, I call it the tin cup mode, where they get just enough money to get started
Hmm.
and they're not even close to demonstrating real value or finding product market fit or developing a full team or anything else, but they're always out raising small amounts of money.
Hmm.
Once in a while that works, but that is not the way to bet. And I have never done that. I've always said, all right, I'm going to take 9 months to put together a business plan, put together a fundraising model, figure out what I really need, raise that amount of money. If I can't raise that amount of money, don't do it. If I can raise
Hmm.
that amount of money, go for it and see if I can build the bridge across the river, demonstrate to investors that we have actually created value here and raise more money at a higher valuation. Now, of course, some of that venture language about higher valuations and stuff may not apply to, let's say, a Proto B or other Game B startup. But I think the concept of enough money absolutely does. And whether
Hmm.
you want to raise your money up front or you want to be in tin cup mode, I think is an important distinction. And I'd say most of the projects that I'm familiar with have been in tin cup mode. They raise some money enough to, buy land, let's say, or put more often a down payment on a land with a big mortgage. Right?
Hmm.
And then they haven't thought through, wait a minute, how are we going to generate enough money to pay the mortgage, let alone move this thing forward? And as you and I discussed in one of our earlier discussions, the amount of money to really build a community, even a relatively small community, is big. Right? If you want to build a community of let's say 50 to 100 people, it could easily cost $20 million, $30 million or more. And now some of that, well, in the early days, you could probably get some conventional bank financing for the land, but that's dangerous for lots of reasons. But building funky hippie houses, you're going to have a hard time getting any bank financing. Say rammed earth houses, etc. That aren't proven to hold their value, blah blah. And so you're going to need the capital to do it to the point of proof of concept. And so you need to honestly think about what is that, and find a way to raise that. And of course, that's the problem, because there are no obvious investors to go to for this kind of thing, because it's not an investment, really. It's not a traditional charity. It's a new kind of thing. We're trying to build a new way of living, and it's going to require some serious bucks to do it. So one of the concepts I've had in the Game B architecture from very early on is the concept of, one name for it is the Game B Foundation. And in reality, there should be multiple of them with different tastes. And these vehicles should raise substantial money, hundreds of millions of dollars, eventually billions of dollars, which are used to fund the development of these projects, typically with some kind of repayment plan associated with them, but not always. Some of them would be, pure infrastructure for the community. And, the money would be raised from Game A people. I often sometimes refer to it as guilt money. Go to people who've made lots of money in Game A and say, hey, you fucked the world up here to some degree, right? Let's be honest. How would you like to make amends by putting $100 million into the Game B Foundation or $1 billion? The other potential source, which I've heard about, personally haven't tapped into it, is the next generation of the recent class of billionaires. So you go to the kids and grandkids of the billionaires, and inevitably some percentage of those will turn against their parental values and will be interested in new ways of living and new ways of being, and humanity surviving into the indefinite future, and appeal to them as funders of the foundation, which can then fund the projects. And of course, like any investment pool, it will have discipline that it requires. It will require, for instance, a community to say, all right, how are you going to break even? How are you going to have cash flows? How are you going to maintain the homeostasis in your membrane from the things that you need from Game A, right? And I mean, that's one of the useful roles that financial intermediaries provide, is providing discipline to those people who get the funds. VCs, as much as we like to complain about them, do filter out a lot of bad ideas. Commercial banks, they probably go too far in the conservative direction, but they also filter out a lot of bad ideas. And so the Game B foundations, amongst other funding mechanisms, would serve as filters for plans that aren't well thought out, that aren't that don't actually have a story of how they get to financial viability in some reasonable period of time. And most of the projects that have been done, both Game B and otherwise, to my mind, have never been rigorous enough in understanding sustainable economics for the membrane.
Okay, so that's and the reason behind that might just be that the numbers become scary quite quickly, in the sense that they become very, very high, right? So if you, like you said, if you start thinking it through, and you say, in the conversation we've had about the numbers of making Game B a reality, first instance is 200 million to run 10 or so communities to see which ones of them survive, to run multiple experiments at the same time. with sufficient redundancy. And this kind of money might feel scary and unobtainable to some of the people in that systems change movement, so that they don't even begin and then go back to tin can mode, right?
Yeah.
Um,
They usually don't. They just ignore, as you say. They look at $200 million. What the fuck, right?
mm,
And I go, yeah, what the fuck? That's hard, but hundreds of millions of dollars get thrown into all kinds of crazy shit, right? And
yep. Plus, if you don't have a viable plan all the way through, then you don't know whether it's actually worth even your time, right?
that's the key. That's why when I'm mentoring wannabe entrepreneurs, I say the bet you're really making is your time,
Mm,
and to invest your time and your emotional energy into a
mm,
tin cup version of an entrepreneur of a startup, I personally don't think is a good allocation of your very scarcest
mm,
resource, which is your time and attention.
mhm,
But it's true of both entrepreneurs and people who want to do social change at scale. Their desire to do it is so large that it sometimes trumps their common sense,
mhm,
and that they don't stop and say, "Yeah, it has to work." This is something I find myself saying a lot in Game B context: is that just as life has to work, every membrane in Game B has to work. The inputs and the
mm,
outputs have to be balanced. We have
mhm,
to, bring in food and get rid of shit, right? At a
mhm,
minimum. And for animals, we have to bring in air as well as and water as well as
mhm,
nutrients, and the same kind of discipline that life has spent 3.5 billion years evolving. We have to design in a more or less engineering fashion so that our membranes can succeed. And without that, they're going to fail. Why do so many of these things fail or reach a very minimal success where they barely survive? Because they haven't
mhm.
been thought through as engines of success and then engines of growth.
And then there's a huge filter to that, actually, because not everybody can afford to sit down for a year or two to really think this through. I mean, we're talking about thinking non-existent entire systems. This is not just a startup that does something incrementally better in a given environment, but this is more or less thinking up an entire ecosystem of interactions. And not everybody has the opportunity to do that. And then the ones that do have the opportunity to do that usually are very, very locked into very specific mindsets that are not conducive to systems thinking in general. So there's already a filter in place of the kind of people and the amount of people that can actually pull this off.
And I think I like the point that it's a huge undertaking. And I've been thinking about this for 14 years and still
Mm,
haven't thought it through, right, fully. Got
mm,
lots of bits and pieces, and I think this is highlights the need for the thinking to be done more cooperatively over a bigger group of people.
mhm,
Find a team of 20 or 50 to think through the various pieces, and then very importantly share those findings more widely. What I
mhm,
call lowering the activation energy of the next person, the next team. This
mhm.
team spends 5 years thinking through how to launch their Proto B. And if it works, publish how you did it so that other people don't have to spend 5 years doing it. And I've long believed that this horizontal information flow becomes one of the key mechanisms by which Game B can take off.
Okay. And so there's there's a filter of not being able to think it through properly. You say it took you 14 years, and maybe there's a if you can get more people to work together on this, which makes it obviously exponentially more difficult, because getting 15 or 20 or 50 people that are generally aligned and liberated enough so they can spend the time and the resources on thinking this through properly as a group, which then also makes it more difficult, because as a group it's generally more difficult to get into a fully aligned state, that's a huge filter set, right? What other potential filters do you see that one should be aware of when trying to move into systems change landscape and actually start doing something?
Yeah, I think another one, and I'm guilty on one half of this, is we've identified the idea of the personal institutional spiral,
Hmm.
where to do this correctly requires a focus on both personal change and developing new institutions, new ways of
Hmm.
governing, new ways of building businesses, new ways of physically living, etc. But there's also the personal change aspect
Hmm.
of getting people to the point where they are actually able to participate in these new kinds of institutions. And that could be hard. And for whatever odd reason, I think I've sort of accidentally made a lot of the personal changes myself in a very
Hmm.
idiosyncratic way that I can deal with this stuff fine. But most people can't. 98% of people can't. And so your team needs to include people who are focused on both sides of this. And they're probably different people because they're different kinds
Hmm.
of motivations, they're different kinds of psychology. So
Hmm.
make sure it isn't all institutionalists, right? And
Hmm.
I think that's actually less common than all personal change people. When you have a community of all personal change people, uh, that might be interesting, but probably you're going to have problems getting your sewage system to work and turning your organic farm into a profitable enterprise. But if you have only people interested in sewage systems and a profitable organic farm, then you're also not those. Then you don't have anybody focused on the personal change part. So looking for a balance in the team between those with expertise and interest in institutional change versus personal change, I think is something that's really important.
Which then exacerbates that problem that I meant, right? The cross links between those people, even if they see the same summit, the paths towards the summit are so dramatically different for some of them. But I'm thinking specifically now in the Oslo project team. I can see this at work, right? The somebody with a 20-year corporate compliance background will think about things differently than somebody who's done activists, artists kind of work in the last 20 years, right? But both see the same thing, literally, and getting those two and the 14 others that we are into coherence towards actually moving as a whole is incredibly interesting and difficult
I would say,
and
and different.
requires a special skill, right? To actually make those connections and keep them stable between the people, help people see the same thing across those different languages, backgrounds, etc.
Yeah, and talk about money.
Mm.
To try to do it virtually, I'm going to predict most of the time isn't going to work. Uh,
Mm.
this kind of coherence, I believe, at least, requires a fair bit of face to face. And face to face costs money, particularly when teams are
Mm.
scattered all over the world. Like in the early Game B days, we flew everybody in and met every 6 weeks. And
Mm.
I do believe that was the magic of that amazing synthesis that happened in 2012 and 2013. And it's a shame we didn't continue it, but for various reasons we didn't. And that cost about to do 5 meetings cost about $125,000.
Mm.
Uh, and we paid everybody's travel expenses, everything else. So,
Mm.
$125,000 isn't a vast amount of money, but it's not a trivial amount of money either. And so one could imagine, that these foundations could provide seed capital for things of that sort, right? Which is not
Mm.
investment capital, but it's sort of idea generation capital. And if
Mm.
you say, all right, we're not going to spend the 125,000, instead we're going to try to do it via, you know, online forums and the occasional group Zooms and things of that sort. My prediction is the convergence and coherence rate seldom happens fast enough for people to stay committed, and they start to drift away. Remember we tried doing that thing with the group
Yes.
of groups, and it was like these are all the right people, but they just never got to be enough synergy and coherence in the conversation. Everybody drifted away.
Yeah, the differentiation I take there is, and it's funny, the Oslo project team is meeting in person this week actually in Berlin, and in 2 weeks in Sicily, and then in Oslo. So there is a strong drive of people to actually meet in person. But the filter I put there is that if there's no reason to dance around the fire or do have something of a similar sort of collective experience that has nothing to do with the project itself, that solely has to do with being in relationship with each other. If we don't have something like this, then meeting in person doesn't make sense. Because if I work on a project, if I want to be productive, in my experience at least, we can be much more productive in the virtual space. But we lack the dancing around the fire
Well,
part.
we can be productive in a low dimensional ish way, right? We're not establishing our personal connections at the highest levels.
Mm,
And so I think both the cognitive and the personal get an upregulation from face to face. But I'm certainly with you that conviviality has to be an important part. You know, the dancing around the fire or the drunken dinner, or we go rafting on the Colorado River together, or some form of group activity. But also just time for people to get to know each other and to
mm.
talk to each other and to learn to trust or not trust each other. And that, I believe, happens much more rapidly in face-to-face, whether it's the cognitive or the convivial, but probably best is if you have both.
I agree. And the rapid part is, I think, crucial because I know, because I've done it, I've built groups that have created deep trust among the members without ever meeting physically. And and I just had a conversation with one of those groups earlier, and I asked them, why is it that you invest 90 minutes every single week to come into this space for years now? And it's that trust. It's that level of trust that people start having in one another once they show themselves as human beings. And this is entirely possible in a purely digital space. I know it for a fact. So, but it takes more time.
Yeah, a lot more time. In fact, even the days before video on these online communities, I'm a member of a community now for
Mm, mm,
37 years. And there are people I've never met, never even seen their picture, right? And yet I have a relatively high level of trust with them, but it takes
mm,
10 or 15 years to get there. In Zooms, it can happen quite a bit faster. But
mm,
to your point, I believe it happens perhaps 10x faster in person
mm.
and higher
That's cool.
dimensional, more
High
things
dimensional. Mm,
than dimensionality, because we're a human is a complex entity, and a group of humans is a very complex entity,
mm,
and uh,
mm,
we are evolved as primates to manage high dimensional relationship spaces intuitively
mm,
and unconsciously.
mm, mm,
And yes, we can do that to a degree in Zoom, but a group Zoom with 15 people,
mm,
it's low dimensional.
mm,
Yes, eventually you can, especially if you have clever facilitators and you work your agenda carefully in advance and make sure everybody has a chance to speak, all these kinds of things, you can slowly ratchet it, but nothing like a group of
mm.
people sitting around a circle and jamming hard for 3 days.
That's true. Okay, so filter one was not thinking it through to the end, and that is exacerbated by the limited amount of people who can afford to do that.
I don't know about
Um,
the afford, because I mean, think about doing startups. At least back in my day, we all had day jobs, right? And we do our startup planning at night and on weekends during vacation. I remember taking my vacation one year and flying up to Boston to jam with a potential startup partner. It takes the allocation of will to do it, but you can do it while you have a day job for sure. In fact, back in the day, that's pretty much what everybody did.
Yeah, but it becomes more exhausting if you have to do some day job and then work that thing at night, and then you're not in full bandwidth anymore. And uh, of course, it's doable,
Yeah, yeah,
but it's a filter, right?
yeah,
Most people don't have that kind of energy, so they don't do it.
yeah.
If they didn't have a day job and had their living covered, then more people would likely be able to engage in that and
Yeah.
want to engage in it.
I think that's true. Though one wonders if the filter is good or bad, right? If you if you have a filter which is okay, we'll fund you to quit your day job and sit around and talk about utopian stuff. I know a lot of people say, "Yeah, I'll sign up for that," but are they the right people to come up with something? Versus someone says, "All right, you got to suffer. You got to do it at night. You got to do it on weekends," and that may be that it's a good filter to find people who are willing, who are that committed to what they want to do. I don't know.
I would use the Nordic folk high school model as a case in point towards the positive, and say that if you give people the space, the safety, the trust, then most of the time something good will emerge.
And fortunately, it's a relatively inexpensive trial to see, right? Fund some of these things, see what happens.
Yeah, so that's filter one. And as a consequence of that, people stay in tin cup mode and don't ask for the real number that they need. Let's say let's fix that at 200 million, for example.
Correct.
And then the next filter stage is the number of people willing and able to provide 200 million to a solid systems change project. I don't see many of those around, right? You said potentially next gen, some with sufficient guilt, yeah, maybe, but that's also definitely a bottleneck.
Well, I think it's a big unknown, frankly.
Okay.
And I don't know how many there are. I mean, I've talked to some, and I do believe there are some out there. In fact, I know there are some
Hmm.
out there. How
Hmm.
many, I don't know. But this is where the foundation could basically become a learning organization to go out there and just relentlessly network with these associations of philanthropies, with family offices.
Hmm.
We could put on events which said, "Hey, you want to save the world?" And just go out and invite 200 billionaires, and maybe 20 will show up. And there's the whole art of raising money at scale, sort of at the scale of major universities or major foundations, is something that there are people who have expertise in. And so I would suggest that is one of the reasons that these Game B foundations should exist, is to come up the learning curve on how do you find those kinds of people, and how do you bring them up the curve to give. And in different people and different asks have different time curves. When you're doing raising money from major foundations, you should figure it'd probably take 2 years, right? From family offices, at least a year. From really rich people, sometimes just a few months. But it depends on the nature of the ask, et cetera. So expertise in mega fundraising, I think, is something that nobody has any experience in who's likely to be involved in social change movement. And why building that institution would fundamentally change the game.
Because that would solve that problem at scale.
Or at least it would provide a pipeline. I think of it almost as plumbing, is that could fund worthy projects. Because again, it'll be like a VC or a bank. It won't fund everything, and shouldn't fund everything, but it will be a relatively easy to tap flow of funds for projects that meet a known criteria of believability. And then that's the group that goes out and takes on the problem of raising the billions of dollars. so that the little groups don't have to develop that expertise because they're not going to have the expertise.
Well, that's ultimately what we're building with the Oslo project, right? Uh, that exact machinery, so that it there's a compliance membrane, that's what we call it, between the external world and the internal, and then whatever happens with that money, it's life-serving. We can talk about that for a long time, but that's exactly what we're building.
And that's, I think, without that, the chances of serious social change happening in a positive direction go down substantially. You end up with little projects that never take off, or you end up with cynical, self-serving projects. I think it's an absolutely necessary part of the serious social change movement is to be able to get pipelines of initially hundreds of millions and eventually billions of dollars that can flow to worthy projects.
And how many of these kinds of projects like that unlock that kind of money on behalf of the system change movement do you see happening in the world, or do you see emerging, or at least as ideas in some people's minds?
I mean, I know there's dozens for sure of just people I know who, if they knew that if they did X, Y, and Z, they could tap into sufficient funds to do their vision. Certainly dozens. And if you got the word out to the systems change world, it would probably be in the hundreds pretty quickly.
No, that for sure. So the consumers of that, yeah. But at the level of the Oslo project or the Game B Foundation, what do you see on that level emerging in the world at the moment? Is there others that are doing something similar?
I'm not aware of it, but again, I haven't. It's not an area I've made a study of either. But there needs to be a crew whose job it is to understand this domain.
We haven't seen any so far.
That want to directly fund projects
that are of the systems change nature, right?
Okay.
So something like Helena.org, which is a really great effort, is the closest that I can see, but ultimately it's an infrastructural upgrade for the US. That's what they're doing.
I used to talk to those guys pretty regularly. I should probably reach back to them if they're doing good stuff.
Yeah, I've spoken with one of them, and what they ultimately, as I understand it, want to move into that space that we're talking about.
When I talked to them originally, they were kind of trying to do a hybrid of a VC firm and that. And then they found themselves being more attracted to the VC side of things.
Yeah.
And they put the social change thing on hold.
Exactly. And it's still on hold, but they want to move there.
Okay.
That's what I heard from one of them.
All right. I'll have to reach. I had a couple of good conversations with the two founders, 2 or 3 good conversations. Very smart.
I think they're amazing. I've only spoken with one of them, but I think they're amazing.
I can put that on my list of things to do. So, I don't know. And, I think particularly now with the world, more and more realization that we're coming to the edge of the cliff, it ought to be a story that can be told successfully, but haven't tried. Or tried once unsuccessfully. And, but one of the things you learn when I was in venture, raising money for my ventures and other people's ventures, I'd say, well, if you want to raise your money for your venture, $2 or $3 million, you better get quality meetings with 20 people and try to close 2 of them. And so, money raising is always a numbers game. And the fact that I'm 0 for 1 doesn't bother me in the slightest. If I was 0 for 20, I'd be worried about it. And so, the Game B Foundation or the Oslo Project, whatever, needs to have the infrastructure to identify prospects, reach out to them, sell them on the idea enough to take a meeting, provide it in more detail. And for those who show interest, then follow up and do the whole, essentially business development process of closing them. And it may take anywhere from 3 months to 3 years, depending on what their internal process looks like.
And from that one attempt that you did? What is your key learning or key learnings?
The same one we had at the Santa Fe Institute, which is you need to filter strongly on psychographics,
Mm,
on what is the person, who is this person, and what are they really interested in.
mhm,
As it turned out, the mistake in this case was, and I don't think the person actually knew, but our process helped them clarify. Uh, the version of Game B we presented to them was all bottoms up. The full Game B bottoms up, embryonics, etc. Didn't have the language at the time, but
mhm,
clearly bottom up. And they were much more interested. It turned out that they probably didn't even know it at the time, in top down, trying to change the
mhm,
system from above. Uh, you know, um, Influencing governments, influencing universities, etc. And my take on that is, by the way, that's a worthy thing to try.
mhm,
Uh, I have my doubts about it, but it's not what I'm interested in. So
mhm,
they even offered us some money to do some top-down stuff, and I just said no. Um, so the psychographics ought to be people who are personally inclined to a bottoms-up approach. We had the same thing
mhm,
at the Santa Fe Institute, by the way. Very hard to raise money for the Santa Fe Institute, even though a very wonderful and elite place, because it took someone, and easier today than it was back in 10, 20 years ago, people who understand the concept of complexity and why the problems that we have to deal with as humanity are mostly ones that live in the complex zone. They're much more oriented to writing a check that's, uh, annihilate polio or get mosquito nettings for people or whatever, which are
mhm,
all worthy
mhm,
causes, by the way.
mhm, mhm,
But complexity is not a tangible like that. It's very
mhm,
intangible and requires a
mhm,
high level of hierarchical complexity to understand. And my estimate after being chairman of the Santa Fe Institute for a few years and being involved with fundraising is at most 5% of people with large amount of money um, could be resonated. It's surprising the ones that didn't. People like Bill Gates. You'd think, fuck, Bill Gates would get it. Nope, didn't. Um, and there were some other people of that nearly that stature. Just, huh, what? It just didn't get it. And of course, part of that was on us. We didn't do a good enough job explaining it. But I think it was just a fundamentally hard thing for most people to get. The flip side of that is I've been involved with this California Institute for Machine Consciousness, easiest fundraising sell ever, right? Remember when you were
mm.
a
You mentioned it.
14-year-old techie and you wanted your computer to wake up? That's what we're doing, right? So the story is, it's so exceedingly simple that I think our close rate is like 75%. It's nuts.
Do you think there's a way to tell that big complexity story in a way that is as simple as what you just said about the Institute for Consciousness?
If there is, I haven't found it, nor has the Santa Fe Institute in 30 years working on it. Some very smart people. But if you come up with it, it would be great.
Is that maybe another interesting filter, which is that the people who have really immersed themselves into the complexity are blind to the actual simplicity that it might look like from the outside?
And I think that's always a danger. I know it's a danger for me in Game B, is that I'm so
Mm,
interested in all the intricate little details,
mm,
and nor am I particularly good at public propaganda. And so we should add more people to the mix
mm,
who are
mm,
good at public communications and simplification.
mm,
Yeah. And that applies, by the way, to raising money from billionaires. One of the things I did learn over the years is billionaires are very little different than ordinary people. They just have more money, right? A lot of them aren't too bright. A lot of them are, none of them are lazy. I will say that. One thing I can say about billionaires: never found a lazy billionaire, except not one who made his own fortune. But a lot of them aren't too bright, or they're IQ 125 or something. But they have an idea, and they are relentless, and they're typically focused on execution, things of that sort. So they're not necessarily the kind of people that you can give a complex pitch to. You really do have to cook it down to equivalent of
mm,
pitching Joe, the manager of Wendy's down the street. Some of them aren't much different than that.
And then the question is, how legible is it still to the inside, right? Because if you break it down to that extent, the space for interpretation opens up dramatically, and then you might end up talking about two entirely different things,
Yeah,
which is why there's this pushback against simplification from the ones that have integrated the full complexity.
yeah. We go, that's not right. But we're
Exactly.
probably wrong to do that, and that's a skill
Mm.
that we don't typically find in places like the Santa Fe Institute. They try, have had some success, but not a lot. Game B has tried a little, not enough. Just as there's the foundation or foundations for piping funding, there probably also needs to be some membranes whose job it is to be the transducers of the story to a much wider world and people who haven't spent 13 years thinking about this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's getting easier. I mean, we can, the concept that we are coming to the end of this civilization, in 2012, 2013, people thought you were nuts when you started talking about this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And maybe we were, but there are many more ears to hear. Now, it's not 100%, probably not even 20%, but it's some percent. It's millions of people, even in the United States, and it's tens of millions of people or more worldwide who have ears to hear the story now. And that number will only go up over time.
I just had yesterday, I haven't tracked whether it is really believable yet, but there was an information, I think it came through a PBS channel to me, was that there is a potential tipping point that has been reached in the Antarctic due to a catastrophic decrease of sea ice that has led to the breakdown of a local currency current under the ice shelf, which might, which is part of the AMOC, and if that thing breaks, then that'll might have been the tipping point for breaking AMOC, which in turn then means that large parts of the world are basically cooked or frozen. And that's really, I mean, the fact that there might be a real tipping point today that has been breached, that has these large consequences, really changed something in my felt sense about the whole situation in myself, although I'm very, very close to it already, right?
Yeah, send me a link to that. That would be very interesting, because I will say that as a complex systems guy, while yes, temperature going up to 2.2 Celsius above pre-industrial baseline levels is not a good thing. By the way, 2.25 is a number that I came up with by combining technology, politics, and culture. So no fucking way you're going to do 1.5, right? Ain't going to happen. Sorry, right? I've been saying that for 20 years, which pisses off a lot of people. If we're lucky, it'll be 2.25. And 2.25 is survivable. But when you get into those ranges, this is the thing. You're in the ranges where all kinds of unknown feedback loops can occur. Does the methane crystals on the bottom of the Caribbean Sea start to bubble up? And if they do, then you get into a positive feedback loop that could give us 10 degrees. Or a key current breaks down, either the southern current or there's a northern current also that could easily freeze Europe. If there's a big runoff from Greenland that comes down the Davis Strait, cuts off the North Atlantic Drift, and all you Europeans freeze your ass, right? Because most Americans don't realize this, but all the major European cities are like the equivalent of Winnipeg or something in Canada, where it's cold as shit, right? think Rome is like equivalent of Boston or something. Europe is way warmer than you'd expect for its latitude, and it has to do with the North Atlantic drift. So anyway, positive feedback loops, and again, complex systems perspective, we don't really know where they are or what they are or what their probabilities are. But every time we jack the temperature a little bit more, we are increasing the risks of stumbling into a catastrophic one. But how that fits into communications, I'm not 100% sure. But if there is one that is more tangible and that you say changes the taste in your back of your throat, that would be useful.
At least for me, it does. Yeah. I'll send it to you. Okay, so filters, communication of complexity.
The right kinds of people is clearly a filter. A balance between institutionalists and personal change. One we haven't talked about, when I talked about at the intro, which is the people I know who've been involved in these projects, say the number 2 after insufficient resources is internal decoherence.
Okay. So talk about that. What happens there?
The original Game B movement fell into internal decoherence and broke up into between 2 and 4 pieces, depending on how you think about it. And it's unfortunately a very common thing. Gregory Bateson has a concept called schismogenesis of if there's even relatively small differences between two subsets of a group, they end up putting on, one puts on red armbands, the other puts on blue armbands, and next thing you know, they hate each other. Very, very common in human cultures, and
I would even say that, because earlier we pointed out, or you pointed out, that it should be a group of people, a multifaceted group of people that thinks the intervention through all the way so that they can actually come up with the full cost of it. But in that process, you also, almost by definition, have to work through these potential breaking points that push you into schismogenesis but prior to implementation. So you already have gone through that test as a group, but you need to do it. You need to do the planning as a group that also does the implementation.
And I would also suggest that it's a skill like facilitation or like finance or like being a mechanic, and that you may well not be able to adequately manage it without finding people who have those skills, who can identify schismogenesis when it's threatening and have some techniques, group techniques for diffusing it. Or learning how to live with it. Sometimes you'll have schismogenesis that's legitimate, and you'll have two moieties, as they call them in anthropology, two groups within a single membrane that have different perspectives on important factors, but nonetheless can learn how to live together. So, so I would say put an underline under management of schismogenesis, to identify it, to diffuse it where possible, and to learn to live with it where it's not diffusible.
What other drivers of decohesion could happen inside of a team as it implements?
Well, one of the famous ones, if you go through the stories of all the way back to the land movement, sexual jealousy is a huge one, and complicated secret affairs and cult leaders monopolizing the members of the opposite sex. You should never underestimate the power of lust in human affairs. I mean, in some forager societies, 10% of the deaths are homicides driven by sexual jealousy. And it happens again and again and again in these kinds of organizations. And again, I don't know how you manage that, but it's certainly a failure mode.
That's an interesting failure mode.
Happens a lot.
So I can see that if a group is in the same physical location and actually living together, if it's the same physical location and kind of like a professional work environment in a way, you can probably somehow bind it. But if it's really living together in some location, then it's going to be really hard. Um,
Yeah, and it's and will the one possibility, which is becoming my universal solution for problems, is would radical transparency help, or is it unrealistic to assume that people are going to be transparent about such things? Because it's there are all kinds of things that come from these kinds of energies, but perhaps the worst is when they're hidden.
yeah, I think unfortunately, it's while it would be probably healthy, I think it's probably also unrealistic. I my first serious relationship, we used the model of brutal honesty lived by Sartre and Beauvoir. And that was really helpful. We learned a lot, but it was also not easy. And I don't think everybody, and I don't know how it would have scaled beyond two people,
Yeah.
right? So I think it's really, really hard to cultivate that properly and fast, right? I think you can maybe cultivate it if you're very careful, very deliberate, and very slow, if you have time. But if you don't have time and you need to go and implement, it might be much, much, much harder.
All right, let's move on to a couple of the other obvious ones. The
Yeah.
cult leader phenomenon is another one that happens at a high percentage of these efforts. Uh,
Hmm.
and part of that is human nature. There is, I believe, a difference in people's desire and ability to be leaders.
Mm.
Uh, and that's good, but again, you need structures to keep leaders from aggregating too much power and remaining in position too long and being able to favor their friends and, in worst case, actually engage in corruption, which happens again all the time.
Mm.
You
Mm.
end up with the Bagwan with 22 Rolls Royces. What the fuck, right?
Mm.
So ways to avoid what I call the blight of pathological leadership is going to be hugely important to avoid very known failure modes. And while cult leader type thingies themselves can survive, they can't really duplicate. They can't grow. Their own idiosyncratic thing built around a cult leader, and they are not a model for generally building a new civilization. So I think something that needs to be built into Game B is anti-blight mechanisms.
Mm. Which usually leads back to transparency.
Yeah, transparency is a key part of it, but also structural, institutional aspects like limited tenure in positions, uh,
Mm.
uh, role-based leadership rather than position-based leadership where possible, collective leadership where collective decision making. Uh, you
Mm.
know, don't delegate to one person unless there's an extremely good reason for one person. Three people is quite a bit less dangerous than one person, um, and you know, I guess, and like the Forager operating system, the Chris Bohmian Forager operating system, developing the cultural norm that people lording it over other people are bad, and
Mhm.
that because think about the idea of a boss at work is a really unnatural thing. We're used to it,
Mm.
but if we were foragers, we'd rise up and kill the motherfucker, right? Wouldn't let some asshole in accounting, or even worse, some asshole in HR telling us how to be at work. We go, fuck you, asshole. And so, thinking through carefully the governance of collective action, I think, is an important part of fighting the blight.
Mm.
And it's not going to be easy. It's going to take years of experimentation because you're also bound on the other side that we talked about. The membrane has to work. So how do you have a membrane that works without building in hierarchical, abusive leaders and potentially cult leaders and dishonest people that are going to embezzle from the commons, etc.? These are not easy things. No society has solved them in perpetuity. They're going to be constant work.
Yeah, I think the perpetuity is the key word here, right? You can maybe, although it might be hard, build that in generation one. But as the first people start being replaced by the next generation inside of any organization, that might leak in, and it's really, really hard to then re-establish the original understanding that was established over time and through probably a lot of discourse, and that is then missing. So the onboarding or the inboarding of new participants, even if they seem to be naturally grown into the system as they grew up through or grew into it over time, there needs to be a very conscious inboarding of those people so that they really fully understand the whole concept.
And that the culture itself be its own immune system.
Mm.
Again, the foragers who just won't tolerate it. They won't tolerate,
Hmm.
abusive leadership. And if we can somehow build in the appropriate amount of radical transparency, it makes it much, much more difficult for people to, betray the trust of the membrane for personal gain,
Hmm.
or just power games. This is something we unfortunately did not figure out with the transition from forager world to agriculture world. We fell into chimp space. Chimps are hierarchical, brutal, dictatorial, vicious, etc. And humans fell back into that model when we made the
Mm.
transition to agriculture,
Mm.
and particularly chiefdoms and states and things of that ilk.
What else? We have in our calendars, we have about 9 minutes left. What other failure modes are part of important failure modes for that stack? So we are complete in as
Here's
complete as we can be.
here's a
Yeah.
relatively big one, and it's systematic, and it's one that Game B could actually address in an intelligent fashion.
Okay.
Random fluctuations, right? Uh,
Hmm.
just like in ventures, one of my buddies built a very cool venture, uh, but the VC that was 2 days away from giving him $30 million, it was IBM, had a venture fund at one point. A new CEO came in, and the first thing he did was get rid of the venture fund. And so
Mm.
my guy's venture never happened, even though it was a pretty cool idea. It might well have worked. Um, so the equivalent of insurance, quote unquote, across
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
membranes. Let's say, let's keep it to a more tangible level. Let's say there's a bunch of membranes that are agriculture, and there's a drought uh, in an area that one of the membranes is in doing agriculture, and its crops are completely lost, or an infestation of plant disease or something. Uh, those organizations normally, unless they're part of a bigger collective, they're going to just die, right? If
Hmm.
they're part of essentially a social insurance scheme that extends over a whole bioregion or even larger, then the appropriate use of insurance is risk mitigation of that exactly
Hmm.
that sort. So
Hmm.
random events is a failure mode.
Hmm. And as well as you can insure against them. I mean, that's if you go back to the concrete implementation mode on the ground, that is something you always have to take into account anyway if you build a startup or a community or whatever. Um, and having an institutionalized layer like you're describing as an insurance against those events definitely lowers the thresholds of entry. Um, Maybe in the early phase, I mean, this might be brutal, but some experiments maybe should not survive. right? So
I
it
was going to
might
say that
also
there's the
be.
so-called moral hazard in insurance,
Mm,
which is that people will do things that they know they're insured against, even though they shouldn't.
yeah.
So we want to avoid moral hazard in our social insurance. This is going to be tricky, right? While at the
Mm.
same time providing buffers against legitimate random fluctuations, which you can't say are anybody's fault per se.
But if you call it that, if you can, I mean, you can insure against truly random fluctuations of natural events, for example, or and economic events. Um, but you refuse insurance for other kinds of things that are not truly random.
Yeah.
Um,
And again, designing these kinds of systems, there are professionals who know about such things from the
mhm,
insurance industry. It'd be good to
mhm,
bring some people in act with some actuarial backgrounds and some moral hazard mitigation. I mean, this is a well-known, one of the oldest big businesses in the world is insurance, right?
yeah,
Initially established to insure ships, long distance shipping. And some of those entities still exist to this day, the ones that were set up in 1550 to insure shipping or even pirate ships. Some of them were
mm,
financed. So that's again an expertise. This one of the, I guess one of the other things of failure mode and sort of stylistically is perhaps sometimes insufficient respect for expertise. That being of the right values and the right personal change will be enough to get us through, when in reality, any complex world system is dependent on a significant amount of real expertise.
mm. Okay, but hopping one back, I think there might be an actual opportunity here because actuaries are really acutely aware of the current predicament by their very nature, right?
Yep.
Um, and they also see that the systems aren't moving in a direction that mitigates those risks. So offering actuaries who are acutely aware of the situation a different way of dealing with that situation outside of their existing institutions might be an interesting offer.
That is very interesting. Yeah, there could be what would an insurance company look like
Hmm.
that was completely honest? Well, all insurance companies have to be honest in the long run, all right, or they'll go out of business. But one wonders, what is the culture internally uh, about these coming crunches? Now, we're here in the United States that homeowners insurance rates have skyrocketed over the last 5 or 6 years due to huge losses in California from fires, losses in
Mm,
Florida from hurricanes, losses in Houston from catastrophic rainfall. Um, those things pop out of their financial results really quickly. You
mhm,
write $20 billion worth of payout due to a big event. That has a huge impact on your balance sheet and your operating statement. So I
mhm,
suspect they are pretty well aware of what's going on. Uh,
mhm. Yeah, there are.
One
There have
wonders.
been multiple reports by the actuary um, community about the current situation.
It's funny. I know one of the top actuaries in the United States. He's retired now, but it might be useful to have a conversation with him.
Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
maybe that would be a fun conversation to riff on what a insurance setup look like for a post game A world. Yeah.
yeah, what should you insure? What should you not insure?
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, moral
Good,
hazard
good, good question.
is key to insurance. All right. Well, it's been a good conversation.